Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at one of those high-stakes promises, and we're going to use the best source material we can find to figure out what's holding it up.
Or what's threatening to tear it all down.
Exactly. We are focusing on, one of the most potent and economically tricky claims out there right now. We're talking about the promise of a $2,000 check in your mailbox next spring.
Right, framed by the administration as the largest tax refund season ever.
And this all traces back to President Trump's declaration on December 2nd, 2025. He said, "We're collecting trillions of dollars from tariffs," and that the country was ready for a nice dividend to the people.
It's a really seductive pitch.
It is. The idea that other countries are basically paying for a huge American tax rebate.
Immensely appealing, especially, when you're planning your budget for next year. But as we dug into the research, the financial data, legal analyses, a pretty big shadow of doubt starts to emerge.
A shadow is a good way to put it.
We're seeing major contradictions, huge contradictions in the financial data. And then there are these monumental legal battles that could, frankly, undo the entire thing.
So that's our mission for you today. We want to unpack this promise by looking at 4 major risks the sources detail.
Yeah.
Revenue shortfalls, massive legal hurdles, legislative needs, and of course, the economic backlash that could make the money worthless even if it shows up.
Okay, let's get into it.
Let's start right at the foundation, the money itself. The whole promise rests on this idea that the tariff coffers are just overflowing.
Right.
But just a few weeks before the president's announcement, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, put out a jaw-dropping revision.
It really was. On November 20th, they slashed their 10-year tariff revenue projection by a staggering $1 trillion.
$1 trillion? That's not a small adjustment.
No, it's not a rounding error. The CBO moved its forecast down from $3.3 trillion to $2.5 trillion. So this just raises a huge question. If your expected revenue is shrinking by almost 30%, how can you guarantee a universal $2,000 dividend?
The math just doesn't add up.
It gets a lot harder. And our sources explain why it dropped, which is really telling. It wasn't a calculation error. It was political necessity.
Oh.
The administration had already started walking back some tariffs to deal with backlash from industries here at home and from key allies. That $1 trillion, that's the price of compromise.
So it's chipping away at the foundation before the checks are even designed.
Exactly.
And yet, despite this, this glaring hole, the administration is pushing this very optimistic narrative. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said tariffs are real revenue and a permanent part of the policy landscape.
And you have to project confidence, right? We also saw Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent hinting that Treasury has the pot of money, suggesting the funds are there now.
But he added a huge caveat.
A critical one. He said the allocation needs congressional work.
Okay, let's pause on that. That feels like a contradiction. If the CBO says long-term projections are down $1 trillion, but Bessent says they have the money now, where do the sources say this pot is actually coming from?
And that's the core legislative problem. The money might be collected, sure, but to give out a dividend of this scale, you almost certainly need a new law from Congress.
So they can't just mail checks.
No. Congress has to authorize it, set the amount, figure out the mechanism, and tax deadlines are coming up fast in April 2026. The White House is, they're running out of time to get a bill drafted and through a potentially deadlocked Congress. The timeline pressure here is just immense.
That legislative roadblock is just one risk. But this is where it gets really interesting, because the entire revenue stream, all the money Bessent is hinting at, it all depends on the legal foundation holding up.
Which brings us to the sword hanging over this entire structure.
The legal gauntlet. The Supreme Court is set to rule on whether the president abused his authority by imposing these broad tariffs in the first place.
The specific law is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA.
And arguments were already heard, November 5th.
Yeah, an IEPA is the basis for the entire tariff regime. A loss in this case, a ruling that the administration overstepped. It would be catastrophic for this plan.
It wouldn't just cut future revenue, right?
It could topple the whole structure. And critically, it could lead to demands for repayment of billions in duties that have already been collected. So your surplus becomes a massive liability overnight.
So, of course, they have a backup plan.
Of course. The administration has been quietly discussing it. The idea is to rebuild the tariff structure using existing, less controversial trade laws if IEPA fails.
And the sources named 3 specific sections.
Right. Section 301 for unfair trade practices, Section 232 for national security, and the big one, The temporary fix, Section 122.
Section 122 seems like the easiest path,
Yeah.
right? A quick fix, it lets them slap on temporary surcharges up to 15%. But the analysis we read pointed out a critical flaw.
A fatal flaw, really. It's the 150-day timer. While it allows for duties, they only last for 150 days. So you're forced into this cycle of constant renewal, and that breeds a massive amount of regulatory uncertainty.
Which is poison for business.
Total poison. Businesses planning supply chains, investments, they need stability. They plan 18, 24 months out. The idea of a 150-day timer is the exact opposite of stability. The sources say it scares investors away like a plague.
That instability, I mean, it brings us perfectly to the conflicting economic indicators we found. We have to shift from these, abstract legal things to the real-world impact.
And warpers on consumers.
The White House optimism is strong. Kevin Hassett at the National Economic Council, he's pointing to 2 strong quarters of GDP growth, around 4%.
And industrial production at all-time highs, a forecast of 3–4% growth into 2026.
And U.S. Trade Rep Greer supports this by talking about reshoring, right? Fewer imports boost GDP, and projects like the TSMC fab in Arizona are bringing great jobs home.
And that's the story. That's the backward-looking narrative based on last quarter's numbers.
But how does any of that square with the data point that landed just one day after the president's announcement? I'm talking about the ADP report from December 3rd.
The bombshell.
A complete bombshell that challenges this whole outlook.
It was such a sharp reversal. The private sector said 32,000 jobs in November.
After a pretty good October.
After a gain of 47,000 in October. So if you connect this to the bigger picture, the risk is that these job losses, they aren't just anomalies. The sources call them harbingers of higher unemployment.
A sign that the tariffs are actively choking parts of the economy right now.
Exactly. And we need to be specific about who got hit hardest. According to the ADP data, it was small businesses and manufacturing.
The most vulnerable sectors.
The ones most vulnerable to trade volatility and rising costs for raw materials, all stemming from this tariff uncertainty.
And that gets us to the hidden cost for you, the consumer. Inflation. If tariffs are jacking up the cost of raw materials, steel, electronics, even fertilizer for groceries, what good is a $2,000 check?
Right. If by April your actual purchasing power has dropped by $3,000 because everything just costs more.
It makes the promise feel hollow.
It becomes an accounting shell game. The dividend is just giving you back money that's already been clawed away from you at the store, leaving your family worse off.
Okay, so let's move to the international context, specifically China. Because all those reshoring plans, those fancy new factories, they depend on stable international supply chains.
Especially for critical minerals.
So this latest deal from November 2025, it details soybean purchases. And China's only hitting about a third of its quota so far, and it eases some export controls on rare earths.
And Greer's response is very cautious. He says, we verify, we monitor, we watch.
As he should.
But the sources warn heavily against trusting this. They remind us of China's history of broken pacts, like the unmet goals of the Phase 1 deals. There's this ever-present risk that China could just pivot and use its export licenses to choke off supplies.
So if they restrict the flow of rare earths,
those newly reshored plants could grind to a halt, which would completely undercut the administration's entire economic revitalization narrative.
This leads right into the tech dilemma, doesn't it? Export controls on advanced chips.
The highest-end stuff. AI, quantum computing.
The conflict here is so clear. You have NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang, warning that China won't accept degraded chips and that the U.S. needs to compete globally.
Because China doesn't just want to catch up. They want these chips for their own industries, for AI, and crucially for their military.
So when the Trump administration prioritizes caution for national security, they're making a huge trade-off. It's security over market share.
A massive trade-off. If you degrade the chips to stop military use, you lose sales to foreign competitors. If you don't restrict them, you risk the tech being stolen or copied. And the sources point out that past IP theft is a huge concern here.
So the risk is that the tech could boomerang as weapons or economic tools against us.
Exactly. It's this incredibly high-stakes balancing act. You're trying to safeguard the nation, but in doing so, you might be giving up ground to commercial rivals, all while China is still trying to beat you anyway.
Okay, so let's bring all these risks together. We've got a fragile structure built on legal rulings, future revenue, and shaky international deals. What does the cataclysm scenario look like? What happens if this all shatters by April 2026?
The analysis shows how interdependent these risks are. The $2,000 check vanishes if the dominoes fall in a very specific order.
And it starts with the legal failure.
The chain reaction starts there. The Supreme Court strikes down IEPA. That instantly makes the whole tariff structure illegal,
Forcing them to scramble for that temporary backup plan, Section 122.
which then creates the legislative deadlock. A divided Congress can't agree on how to handle the now uncertain funds. This leads to a revenue shortfall because the CBO slashes its projections even further due to all the instability.
And then finally, the economic backlash. That little ADP job loss we saw explodes into a full-blown recession with roaring inflation.
Because investors panic over that constant 150-day renewal cycle. The projected fallout is devastating. You're talking about a job market collapse hitting specific communities, welders in Ohio, farmers in Iowa facing bankruptcy.
And China.
China sees weakness. They pull back on soybeans, choke off those rare earths. Hassett's 4% GDP dream reverses, and inflation just soars, making basic necessities unaffordable for many.
It's a picture of, betrayal and completely fractured trust. The ultimate lesson here seems to be the need to verify these vows, to watch the shadows cast by conflicting data.
And to see how it's all connected, a single legal ruling can trigger a recession. You have to realize that even if Congress did pass the funding, if tariffs are making your groceries more expensive, you've already paid for your own dividend, maybe multiple times over.
And that brings us to the end of this deep dive. We went from that big announcement on December 2nd all the way through the fiscal, legal, and international pressures that make that check so uncertain.
Whether you're looking at the short-term ADP report or the long-term Supreme Court ruling, this information is vital for understanding the true cost of these policies.
So our final thought for you to consider is this. The core danger our sources highlight is that this dividend becomes a cruel joke, clawed back in taxes, or lost to deficits ballooning to catastrophe.
So you have to ask yourself, when policies promise healing but have the potential to cause this much harm, what level of accountability is needed to ensure we don't wake up one day to find ourselves in chains forged from false gold?
A powerful note to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.